Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Simon Mundie, and I have the privilege, and it is a privilege, and the honor of hosting this episode, bringing together two titans of consciousness. I hope you don't mind me using that. That's what I came up with. Rupert Spira, of course, and Tom Campbell. Now, Tom, I'll introduce you first. A former NASA scientist, also the author of the MyBigTOE trilogy, Theory of Everything That Is, which, and I lifted this quote, by the way, from your website, Tom, unifies science and philosophy, physics and metaphysics, mind and matter, purpose and meaning, the normal and the paranormal, as well as shines a light on the common spiritual basis of the world's major religions while placing belief, dogma, and creed into a bigger picture. So that's Tom. Rupert Spira can be a little hard to put into a box. I know you describe yourself as a friend. You don't like to be too pinned down. Others, including myself, see you very much as a teacher, specifically of the non-dual understanding, and even more specifically, I would say what is known as the direct path. I've picked a quote of yours too, Rupert. I hope you don't mind. That reads, the greatest discovery in life is to discover that our essential nature does not share the limits nor the destiny of the body and the mind. So basically, Tom's background, your background, Tom, is in science. Rupert, your background is as an artist. So I just want to say, I think it's important. Lots of people have been calling for this interview. It's, on both sides. I know people have been approaching Rupert, and I know people have been approaching you, Tom, as well. And it's really exciting to bring the worlds of science and art together, and particularly if you're interested in these matters, as I am. So for a tennis fan like me, and I know you both like a metaphor, it's like watching a match between Roger Federer and Rafa Nadal, only insofar as we're not looking for a winner. This is a match played for the joy of playing. Still, I'm going to be umpiring to some degree. Anyway, so that's the intro. I think what we're looking to do here is we're looking to explore the similarities between both of your approaches and outlooks, talk about some possible areas of difference, and as well extract some of the implication and even perhaps some calls to action, if you will, of both your work. So first things first, does that sound okay to both of you, Tom?
Mm-hmm. Sounds just fine.
Very good.
Very good. Excellent. So listen, let's start at the start with some origin stories. Basically, how you both got to where you are now. Tom, if we could start with you, your path has been a very, very interesting one, combining science and spirituality and consciousness. So just if you can give us a brief resume of, perhaps, I don't know, you could start with your first out-of-body experience when you were a young lad to sitting right here now, a truncated form, please.
Right. Yes. 76 years in less than 7 minutes. All right. We'll see if I can manage that. That's a challenge for me. Indeed, I was born into this world very right-brained, very intuitive, very holistic. Big picture. These are lots of different terms that gives the audience an idea. I was a child that when at 5 or 6 years old, I was beginning to invent my own magic. I found these little seeds that would fall out of trees behind my house, and to me, it was obvious that if you tossed one into the air and then you had an intention before you caught it, it would come true. And I would sit in the back of my dad's car trying to make all the traffic lights be green just as he got to them, because I knew that my intent could do things like that. So I just was born that way, a right-brained individual, very strong in the intuitive side and not so strong on the logical side. But I knew that I had to develop that logical side. That was the reason I was here, that logical side was something I had to work at. So as I was in 6, 7 years old, I had entities come to me and take me out of body, actually show me how to go out of body, how I could go explore consciousness space. I was put in courses, instructed how to get around and how to work in that space, things to do, things not to do. That sort of thing.
Instructed by whom? Sorry, Tom.
Just other let's say, just other entities, other consciousnesses like me, except a lot wiser and a lot more mature. But interesting enough, Simon, when I was in that out of body, I wasn't 6 or 7 years old. I was kind of a young adult. When I'd come back, that was one of the amazing things. You'd come back from that more adult picture back into the body of a 6-year-old, and it was quite a transition. So that was really my beginnings. But then eventually that all stopped. And it stopped with the explanation that I needed to grow up normally. So, I wouldn't be so weird. I wouldn't be so different than everybody else. That was important, that I be more average, normal, fit in, because that would help me grow up more balanced. So that went away. And that was explained to me. I was told that this is going to go away. You're not going to be able to do this anymore. We're not going to come down and take you out. The courses are over for now. You will get back to it. Well, I got back to it after I got out of graduate school. I was working on my PhD in physics. I'm a physicist. And when I was in graduate school, I saw a sign that said, learn how to meditate, get by with less sleep. And I thought, it's just what I need. So I took the meditation, and it was a natural. The very first time I sat down with my very own mantra, that I had given a banana for, and, there it was. I just disappeared into consciousness space. And what seemed to me like maybe 5 minutes later, I was nudged to say, it's time to go. And I realized I'd been there for almost an hour. So that was my first meditation as it was coming back later. Well, got out of graduate school, took a job, met Bob Monroe. Bob Monroe is the guy who wrote books, Journeys Out of Body, Far Journeys, Ultimate Journey. And it turns out he lived only a 45-minute drive away from where I lived. So a bunch of us went out to meet Bob to see, is this guy real? Is he just making this up, trying to sell books, or what? So I went to see Bob, and Bob was a very rational guy. He had the personality of an engineer, very matter of fact, very factual. And his books were just like a diary. This is what happened to me. So he was in the process of putting together a laboratory to study consciousness, because he very much wanted this experience of his to be on the science mat, to be kind of justified as real. He didn't want it to be the crazy old guy that did these strange things. He wanted this to be science. So he was wealthy, so he set up a lab and wanted scientists to help him do it, and I just happened to be there, so I volunteered. And the deal was that I would be his scientist if he would teach me how to do what he did, to have those experiences. Well, it was a natural. I came to those experiences again very quickly. And pretty soon, all of that I had forgotten long ago, poured back into my mind, and I was reawakened to it. And my position as a physicist was that I wanted to understand it. How did it work? Why did it work? As a graduate student, I had learned that I could go into a meditation state and debug my software. I would see the software scrolling by and the output, and those lines of code that had problems with them would be red, and all the rest would just be black on white. And then I'd go check, this is back in the days of boxes of cards, and I'd go back and check my boxes of cards, and sure enough, that statement I saw that was colored red was the problem statement. Even to the point that sometimes I couldn't find the problem with it, but sure enough, that's where the system bombed. It was because the card punch wasn't exactly lined up right, and the machine was unable to read it, and that's what was bombing the program. So it found even those kinds of things. And as a physicist, that was astounding, as you can imagine. So it's like suddenly here's all the rest of this reality that I really don't know about. And a physicist, what we do is model reality. That's our job. So suddenly my job got bigger. And I thought, well, how does this work? Then I was with Bob Monroe, and then I was back out into the out-of-body space, the mental space. We were playing with all sorts of paranormal things, trying to convince ourselves that it was real, that we weren't just making it up, because that was the first hypothesis going in, is that we're just making it up. So eventually, let me fast forward now, 35, 40 years later, I had been doing research in consciousness. In other words, okay, I could use my mind to heal. I could use my mind to remote view and do these things. And there were lots of variables of my attitude and how I felt and my diet and just lots and lots of things that you could change. So I changed one, repeat, see how it worked. Change another one, repeat, see how it worked. And it wasn't that simple. You'd have to do this like 20 times. You'd change a variable, then 10 or 20 times you'd have to work that way. Then you'd change another variable. Well, 35 years later, I thought I had an idea how it worked and what was significant about it. In other words, I'm a scientist studying consciousness from the inside, not from the outside looking at other people's consciousness, but from inside my own consciousness. And I write the trilogy. Shortly after writing the trilogy, I got some aha moments and realized that I could take that theory of consciousness that I had written in my trilogy, and I could define and derive physics. Matter of fact, specifically, I could derive quantum mechanics and answer the big questions like, why should particles be best described as probability distributions? How did quantum physics work? Because physicists don't know that. They just say it's weird science. Well, my understanding from consciousness said it's not weird at all. If you understand consciousness and understand how reality works, it's a logical science like any other science.
Yeah.
And I could answer the outstanding paradoxes there with perfectly reasonable, understanding. And the same for relativity. Relativity, the big question is, why is C a constant? So anyway, that's where I am, where I come from.
There we go.
I'm getting the sign, like, Tom, it's time to wind this up. So
you spotted it. I thought I was being subtle.
I'm seeing your sign. All right. So basically, then I have a trilogy, and better yet, I have about 1,000 hours of YouTube video.
And many subscribers as well.
Yeah, that starts with the idea of creating a model of reality, a scientific model of reality, and it comes to the astounding conclusion that consciousness is fundamental.
Right, Tom, I'm going to stop you there because you're now veering into my next question. So you're up to date, but that's a nice little place to actually park it just for a second.
Okay, good.
Rupert, I'm going to turn to you, and if you wouldn't mind, just a little bit of your origin story as well, and these. Feel free to ignore me, but the thing that always sticks in my mind was the comment I think you made to your mother as a boy that you believed we were a dream in God's infinite mind. And here we are, however many years later, I wouldn't want to speculate, and you now are pretty sure of that fact.
Yes, indeed. Let's start there because, in fact, it's exactly where Bob finished off by saying that his model suggests basically that consciousness is fundamental. I expressed this. Apparently, my mother takes every opportunity to remind me as a 7-year-old boy by, as you rightly said, saying to her that I think that the whole world is a dream in God's mind. And I apparently then went on to say that I felt that our role in the dream was to make the dream as beautiful a dream as possible. So this was a childish intuition that was expressed in the Christian language in which I was brought up, and I then forgot this intuition and just carried on a regular upbringing, school, or all the regular experiences that young boys go through. I have to say, my childhood and teenage years were considerably less extraordinary than yours, Tom. I have no out-of-body experiences to relate. And as I say, I forgot this early intuition and just became immersed in a very ordinary, typical, regular upbringing as a boy and a teenager. In fact, my father used to remind me regularly that apparently my housemaster from boarding school, where I was, in fact, I spent all my education in boarding school, age 13, he wrote to my father once and said, "When is Rupert going to start being interested in something apart from football and pop music?" So, so it took a couple more years for my housemaster's wish to come true, aged 15, 16, let me just back up a little bit. Really from the age of probably 10, 11, 12 onwards, I was interested in science, particularly biochemistry. I wanted to go into something, either medical research or biochemistry, but I was definitely on track for a scientific career. When I was 15 or 16, two things happened which changed the course of my life. The first was I was introduced to the poetry of Rumi. Now, of course, Rumi is well known by millions of people, and we're accustomed to the beautiful translations or perhaps I should say renderings of Coleman Barks and others who have really translated his poetry into contemporary language. In those days, the translations were much drier and more erudite. Arbery and Nicholson made translations of the Mathnavi and Rumi's poetry. So these were the translations I had and loved them very much. And Rumi's poetry, I think, reawakened in me this early intuition that I had as a young child, that what we know of as the universe is God's, or a dream in God's infinite mind, and that we are characters in that dream. So, and then the other experience that happened to me, I aged, I think 15, I went to an exhibition of a man called Michael Cardew, who was one of the founding fathers of the British studio pottery movement. And walking into his exhibition at the Camden Arts Centre, I can close my eyes and I can enter that room, that exhibition space again for the first time. And I was blown away by what I saw. I had never seen objects like this that had such visceral, evocative power. And I really decided there and then that that's what I was going to do in life. I came away with this, just a simple desire. I'm going to learn. I want to learn to make things like this. So at this point in my life, my interest in science came to a fairly abrupt end. I left school. I went to art school. I ended up actually spending the last 2 years of Michael Cardew's life with him. He was 80 years old when I started my apprenticeship with him, and I had the last couple of years of his life with him. And at the same time, early when age 16, I learned to meditate, and I became very interested in the classical Advaita Vedanta tradition, which I learnt at a school in London called the Study Society at Collett House in London. And it was run then by a man called Dr. Francis Rolls, who I really considered to be my first teacher. And he would go every year to India and spend time with the then Shankaracharya of the north of India, Shantananda Saraswati. And he would bring back the classical Advaita teaching. And I spent 20 years in this school, going regularly, at least twice a week. I learned to meditate. I was attending regular weekly groups, studying the philosophy of non-duality. I learned the Mevlevi turning in Rumi's tradition. I learned Gurdjieff's movements. And this really, this interest was really the central point, the focal point of my life for the next 20 years. In the meantime, of course, I left art school. I finished my apprenticeship with Michael Cardew. I set up my first studio. So I was working as an artist in my studio, having exhibitions. And so these were my two overriding interests in life, beauty and truth. My interest for beauty was satisfied in my studio, and my interest in truth was satisfied by my study of the Advaita tradition, as I say, through the classical Advaita teachings, but also through my study of Ramana Maharshi and Nisargadatta's teachings, which you will be very familiar with. After 20 years or so, I felt that I had come really to a kind of limit. I hit a wall. I deeply intuited that everything I was reading and hearing from the non-dual tradition was true. This was more than just a belief that it was true. There was a deep intuition that it was true, but I could not make it my own truth. I couldn't realize it for myself. So I began to move away from College House. And at that time, I was going to spend some time in Ghana, in Accra, and help somebody set up a pottery there. And I went to Watkins Bookshop. You may be familiar, the famous esoteric bookshop in London. Just before my trip to Ghana, I wanted something to read, and I picked up a magazine off the magazine rack. It was called Self-Inquiry, produced by the Ramana Maharshi Foundation, which I had never heard of. Anyway, I put the magazine in my bag, went off to Ghana, staying in this little hotel on the outskirts of Accra. And one evening I opened this magazine and I came across an article called Return the Eye to the Source by a man called Robert Adams, who I hadn't heard of. Now, I read the article and I remember weeping when I finished reading the article. It was as if, this is the way I formulated it to myself at the time, it was as if God had answered my prayer, my unspoken prayer being, how do I make this non-dual understanding my own? And this article was written not just as a general response to my question, it was like tailor-made for me. So I thought, okay, as soon as I get back from Accra, I'm going to go and see this man, Robert Adams. Fast forward 6 months. I arrive in Sedona to meet Robert Adams, rent a little apartment in the local town, and the next day Robert Adams dies. So I spend that evening with a small group of his students in his room, with his body dead on the bed, covered in flowers, and all his students singing songs. And so I'm very puzzled by this, and not to mention profoundly disappointed, because I felt that this man was this article had such a profound effect on me. I was, to say that I was looking forward to meeting him would be an understatement. Anyway, on the last day of my trip, somebody gave me a leaflet and said, here, read this on your way home. Put it in my bag, didn't think anything of it. Fast forward a couple of months. I then make contact with the Ramana Maharshi Foundation, Jane and Alan, who used to write the magazine. I invited them down for a weekend to where I now lived had my studio in Shropshire. And they said, we want to we want to hold a retreat somewhere in England for a man named Francis Lucille. And I thought, that's funny, isn't he? Wasn't he the guy on the leaflet that person gave me on the last day in Sedona? So I went, had a look at the article, looked it up, and sure enough, it was a short dialogue from Francis Lucille, and I had liked it very much. I remember it was a response of his in answer to the question, "What can we expect from these meetings?" And so, quite spontaneously, I said to Jane and Alan, why don't you ask him to come and do the retreat here? We've got plenty of space. We'll clear out my studios and the gallery space in the barns, and we can put people up. Fast forward 4 or 5 more months, Francis turns up at my home. We've never met each other. we sit down. The first words he say are, meditation is a universal yes saying to everything. And at that moment, I feel this shiver running up my spine. And I realize this was why I went to Sedona. I've finally met the teacher that will enable me to make this non-dual understanding my own. So after that meeting, I had a conversation with Francis, told him this story. And I said, what do I do now? And he said, just come as often as you can and as often as you want. He happened to live in Southern California then. So in spite of the fact that I had a young child and I was leading a pretty full, active life as an artist, I went several times a year to week-long retreats with him and spent as much time as I possibly could over the next 13 or so years with him, initially asking a lot of questions, but the questions in time died down. And over this period of time, I can't say exactly how and I can't say exactly when, everything that I had read about and heard in the classical Advaita tradition and everything that I had so deeply intuited was true began to become my own lived and felt experience. One last part of this story, Simon, because I can see you're getting
twitching.
You're twitching.
You're going to have to stop commenting on it, gentlemen, soon. But anyway,
okay, all right. Fast forward again. So now this is after 13 or so years with Francis. I'm on a train to the opening of one of my exhibitions in Edinburgh, and I start just spontaneously writing, just for the joy of it, on my laptop on the train on the way up. This essay develops into a series of essays which Non-Duality Press then publish as my first book, The Transparency of Things, as a result of which I began to receive invitations to speak around the world in America and Europe. And then gradually over the next few years, these invitations began to increase, so much so that at some stage I had no longer had time for both activities, my work as an artist in my studio and this new life writing and speaking about non-dual matters. And I never really made a conscious decision, but gradually my life just went more and more in the way of writing and speaking about these matters, which is how I find myself today.
And here we are. And here we are. And here we are. And a comment of yours that I've read recently, and actually I've recently finished Transparency of Things. I've read many of your books, Rupert, but I've recently read that one. And I only actually found out latterly that it was your first. But I know, just to add a detail, at one point as well, you were in your studio and a thought came into your head, I want to make bowls of words. I've heard you say that recently, and then
yes.
And then here you are now, Rupert. I'm going to stay with you for the next one. Then, so the backstories are done, and I want to now get into the detail of your understandings and your models. So, Rupert, again, I'm going to start with you because I feel my hunch is that you're going to be able to explain yours. In my experience, a little quicker. So I would like you, if you would, to, how would you summarize the non-dual understanding, the direct path, the teachings that or the conversations you have with people about this understanding? How would you summarize it, if you could, and here's the challenge for you, in less than 5 minutes?
The general overview I would describe like this: that reality is a single, infinite, and indivisible whole whose nature is pure consciousness, or in religious language, spirit, or we could also say love. And that everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence from it. That's basically it.
So that was good. That was much less than 5.
I'll
Sorry,
just add one more. That's the understanding in a sentence. What are the implications of this understanding? I'd like to describe this in 2 ways. One in reference to our internal experience, and one in reference to our so-called external experience, our relationship with others, objects, the world. In relation to our internal experience, the implications of this understanding are peace and happiness. Peace and happiness are the inevitable consequences on the inside of this understanding. And in terms of our experience on the outside, love is the inevitable consequence of this understanding. Love in relationship to people and animals, and in relation to objects, the same experience is referred to as beauty. So the implications of this understanding are peace and happiness on the inside, love and beauty on the outside.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad you shared the implications, because that's definitely where we're going to be heading a little later. Tom, here, over to you. I mean, my big theory of everything, this really is a challenge. So I'm going to give you a little bit more free rein than Rupert got. And Rupert was generously short there. So he's handed you a couple of minutes. So if you could take away by explaining as far as you can your take on it all. And then perhaps as well, once you've done that, having heard what Rupert just said, how perhaps it aligns with Rupert's view of things.
Well, I hope you don't mind, but let me address those two things in the opposite order.
Go for it.
So first, I'd like to say that Rupert said it perfectly. Everything that Rupert said and how he expressed it is exactly, the same ideas, conclusions, and knowing that I have come to. The only thing that would be different between his description and mine is I probably would not have used the word infinite. And that's because as a physicist and a math guy, infinity means something a little more technical to me. So rather than infinity, the metaphor, I'm with him. Infinity, the actual thing, I have a problem with that, you see. So that's just my technical viewpoint. But anyway, so I start out by saying, yeah, what Rupert said, that's it in a core. Yes. Now, the interesting thing is that I came to that totally differently. I didn't have any teachers. I didn't have any spiritual teachers at all. I derived what I derived from my own study of consciousness on my own. Now, yes, I did read books, but probably from a viewpoint of somebody like Rupert, not all that many books. I'm not that well read on the subject, but I found things in the Eastern philosophy that kind of, I understood that. These ideas work for me, but that's not where I started. I started with science and with investigation and with study. And my model basically also says that consciousness is what is fundamental. Consciousness is the source of everything. But I got to that because in my studies of my own consciousness, I realized that I could, with my intent, my conscious intent, modify things in the physical reality. But I could not, with my, do anything physical that really changed consciousness at all. So to me, that says the arrow of causality is from consciousness to the physical. That means that consciousness is the superset and the physical is the subset. So that, when I got to that point, I knew that consciousness was the fundamental thing, not physical. So I developed the same understanding as Rupert, and I slowly had to own it as he did. It's a matter of, for me, I'd say that it's a matter of taking it from the intellect and taking it into the level of being. You have to live it. You have to be it. And when you be it, then it's yours and you own it. If it's just thoughts, it's just intellectual, well, then you can think about it and you can discuss it and you can compare it, but it's not yours. You have to live it and be it. And for me, that was just a gradual process of understanding of what's important and what's not, what's significant and what's not. And some years in this process, I kind of surprised myself, caused myself to have to laugh a bit, because as the young, brash, arrogant physicist that I was, most young men, now I'm learning these things starting probably in my middle 20s. My first connection with meditation was probably, 22, 23, somewhere in that neighborhood. So I'm a young adult as these ideas are coming to me. And I was astonished that much of what I had seen of religion, not the dogma, not the creeds, not all that stuff, but what matters, the cores of that, I found out it was actually true. And that made me laugh, because as the brash, arrogant physicist, I was, religion, that's foolishness, for weak-minded people who need something to cling on to, et cetera, et cetera. You know how the kind of the atheist viewpoint is. Well, that was my viewpoint. Reality is nothing more than what you can measure. If you can't measure it, it isn't important. That's called an operational definition of reality. So there I was at that spot and had to make the transition to a much different spot, which was realizing that there are two different worlds out there that we live in, and one's the objective world and one's the subjective world. And that the one that is most important, where most all the real action is, where all the real substance is in the subjective world. I mean, think of all the choices that you make that are really important. Who do I marry? What job do I take? Things, where do I live? Who am I? All of those are entirely subjective. And the objective world, well, that's just the props on the stage. That's just the stuff. Well, okay, some of that can be sort of important, but that's not where, the real significance is in living, in being. So just approaching it as a scientist, looking at what is real, what is meaningful, what is significant, and what is not, I eventually came to be where Rupert is, from that viewpoint of understanding that consciousness is fundamental and that everything else is derived thereof. Now, I did that with a model. I put together a model of reality, because that's what physicists do. They model reality. So, I'm a creature of science. So I looked at all the facts that I knew from my study of consciousness, and I looked at all the facts that I knew from my study of physics, and said, what understanding, what model can I come up with that answers all of those facts, the physical facts and the subjective facts and the objective facts? So I worked on that, and eventually I ended up writing the book, my answer to that. And what the answer was, in a very short explanation, is that consciousness is about information. Consciousness is an information system. Now, what we're conscious of in our physical body, which I call the avatar, it's your physical body is an avatar. Mm-hmm. We're just conscious of the information that comes through our five senses. That's the information. Now, in consciousness itself, there's a lot more information. All that subjective side is also information. Understanding is information. Knowing is information. Now, it's not just information, but as consciousness, it's what you make of that information. It's how you interpret that data. That's what I'm calling information. So the information isn't the data. It's the content. It's the meaning. It's the significance. It's the understanding. That's the information, not data. Okay, so when I saw consciousness as an information system, I realized that consciousness as a system is evolving. Systems change. That's just the nature. We grow, we change. I knew I had grown, I had changed, and I know everything else kind of grows and changes with time. And because I'm a physicist, I have to see things as finite. That's why I would not use the word infinite. It's finite. It is not perfect. It doesn't know everything, or it doesn't, it can't pay attention to everything at once. It's a finite system, but it, to us, would appear infinite. It is everything. Everything not only we do know, but everything we can know. We cannot get outside of the system because we are of the system. And we are just subsets of that system. Now, if you're a computer scientist, you'd say we were, a partition off a piece of that system. So we're a piece of that system, a virtual machine inside a larger machine. However you say it, we're just a subset of that. We are it. Yeah. And that old phrase of we're one, it's true. We are one. So now I saw consciousness as an information system. Information systems evolve by lowering their entropy, by creating information and the value of that information. I saw this whole reality as a virtual reality where our body is the avatar. Consciousness is our consciousness. Consciousness is the player. The body's the avatar. And then I started applying the logic of virtual reality, just like our virtual reality games. Consciousness is the player, makes all the choices. Consciousness is a choice-making machine. I define consciousness as awareness that makes a choice. Therefore, things like consciousness, time, free will all go together. And they are diametrically opposed to things like determinism and materialism. Those two are incompatible with each other. Yeah. So that's my model, that this is a virtual reality. And from that model of virtual reality, I also concluded that it had to be a top-down probabilistic virtual reality, because virtual realities are computed. And being a physicist, I do a lot of creating models with computers. So I know a little bit about how that works. And the way this has to take place is our physical reality is a virtual reality that has evolved. It wasn't programmed, it's evolved. You have initial conditions and a rule set, and you just push the run button and let it run. And it evolves. The initial conditions were what we call the Big Bang, a ball of plasma, high temperature, high pressure. And you let that evolve according to the rule set, which is what we call science. Scientists dig out the rules. That's their job. So I see this as a virtual reality. And from that, I can deductively see how the speed of light must be a constant, because you can only move 1 pixel of distance for 1 pixel of time in a simulation. I can see how quantum mechanics comes to the conclusion that reality is information, because it's computed. And I can see how it's computed and why statistics and probability is at the top, which you have a more deterministic rule set underneath creating those probability distributions. So from a scientific viewpoint, from a computer science viewpoint, using computers, information, and that sort of thing as metaphors. So I'm not saying it's a computer. No. I'm saying computer science provides me with metaphors that I can use to describe this consciousness. So I see ourselves as individuated units of consciousness, okay? And that's a little virtual machine inside the bigger machine, a subset, if you will. Okay, so that sort of metaphor then leads to a model from which a better physics can also be derived. So that's kind of my take on this. It comes to the exact same conclusions that Rupert comes to, and you have to own it in an exact same way. You have to be it and live it. It's not just an intellectual understanding. It's something that you can do. I find that where you end up is just in a larger reality. Okay, I live in the physical reality in the sense that my avatar here is active and I'm conscious making those choices. But at the same time, I live in a larger reality than that. There's this larger reality has information that's not in the physical, but I have access to it intuitively. We can process information in two paths. One's the intuitive path and one's the intellectual path. And the intuitive path has access to lots of information. But the process of accessing that path is kind of problematical. It depends on you and how much you understand, the quietness of your mind, the depth of your thinking and understanding. On the other hand, the intellectual path has a very exact process called logic. You see, but logic fails because there's not enough information to be deductive. So the two together are fantastic. You have that intuitive side that has access to all the understanding and information, and that intellectual side that has the logic. And then you just live in this larger reality. So you understand things from a bigger perspective. You have more choices, a bigger decision space. And that's where one ends up. So I think this is kind of a beautiful connection between Rupert and I, because we see two people that basically have come from very different processes in very different places, but we end up at the same result, because there are, let me put it the other way, there is only one truth, but there's thousands of different paths to that truth. And every one of those paths is important and necessary.
Something I'd noticed, Tom, I've just picked up on as you were talking, you both have come from these different paths. But interestingly, you said at the start that you were very intuitive and you had to develop your logical scientific side. Rupert said that he had this interest in science. So actually, there's something going on there. I thought that was quite interesting. I want to return to a couple of bits that you've said before I ask Rupert to explain a couple of bits. But the first actually is around infinite, because I remember I've interviewed Rupert myself on my podcast, and I remember speaking, Rupert, to you about this and about I thought of infinite as that classic sort of expanding in all directions forever. But actually, you explained that was a misunderstanding.
Well, okay. Let me talk a little bit about.
This one's for Rupert, Tom. I just want him to answer back to this.
I see.
Yes, the normal idea of infinite, the layperson's idea of infinite, is that infinite just means extended indefinitely in all dimensions. Time goes on and on and on and on forever. Space goes on and on forever. Infinite, at least in the way that I use the word, I think this is not the mathematical use of the word. I use the word infinite to mean not finite, which means having no dimension at all, dimensionless. Now, it's not possible for a human mind to think of or visualize something with no dimensions, because everything we think of or imagine is filtered through the limitations of our own minds. And our own minds operate in 4 dimensions, 1 dimension of time, 3 dimensions of space. That's how we visualize. So everything we visualize is within the framework of the limitations of our own mind. So it is literally not possible for us to visualize or even think of something with no dimensions, because it's only possible to think of something that has some extension in time or space. So by infinite, I literally mean without any dimensions at all. And that it is, if we can speak of it this way, the activity of this infinite, in inverted commas, consciousness, which from the position of what you, Tom, refer to as an avatar, what I would say from the localized perspective of each of our finite minds appears to us as the physical universe. What we are really perceiving, in my language, I would suggest, is the activity of infinite consciousness. I think, if I understand you correctly, Tom, you would say it was information, but what we are perceiving is the activity of infinite consciousness as it appears when perceived through the faculties, the limited faculties of each of our localized minds, or the avatar, as Tom calls it. And in other words, it is the limitations of our own mind that render the activity of consciousness as the universe that we perceive.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Does that make a bit? How does that square up for you, Tom?
Well, I would again. I agree with everything that Rupert says here. Consciousness is dimensionless. It is beyond what we can comprehend. It is, far. Just to say it's beyond what we can comprehend is an understatement. Yes, indeed. All of that I agree with. But I still would not use, I would use the metaphor of infinite. It appears infinite. Yes. It would seem infinite to us. But floating in an inner tube in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the ocean would appear infinite to us as well. We would see nothing but ocean for week after week after week floating in this inner tube, and it certainly would seem infinite.
Yeah. But this is the problem with semantics, isn't it? I mean, it's the limits of language, which is why God, for example, is such a loaded word.
Yeah. Rupert uses different metaphors than I use. I think is primarily the difference between us is our choice of metaphors. I come with the metaphors of science. He comes with the metaphors of philosophy.
Yeah.
And basically, the reason I would say that it is not, and I don't use the word infinite, as though I would agree with all that description. I would say that's a metaphorical infinite and agree with it entirely.
Yeah.
But actually, infinity is something that can never be achieved. Infinity only exists as an abstract concept. Nothing real can be infinite. You see, nothing real goes forever. Forever is just infinity in time. So the fact that I can't see a boundary, can't experience a boundary, can't see an ending, it just seems to go on. Well, that's okay. So does evolution. Just go on. Evolution doesn't get to a point where it says, all right, nothing else to do. Evolution just is open-ended. It just is, and it just goes. So I say that consciousness is a real thing. Matter of fact, I say it is the only real thing. And because it's a real thing, it can't be infinite. And it is not supernatural. It's a natural thing. So, of course, a scientist would want to see whatever it is he's working on as a real thing, a natural thing. Science doesn't start with supernatural things that are beyond existence. So it exists, it's real, therefore it's finite. If finite, it has boundaries, but those are boundaries beyond what we can ever see, understand, or experience. They're outside. And what is beyond that boundary? Well, it's just unknown.
Yeah.
We just don't know. And not only that we don't know, but we can't know. Because we are consciousness. We are part of that system. So we can't see outside the system because we are the system. We're inside the system. So nevertheless, consciousness is the only thing that is real. It's fundamental. Everything else is virtual, which means a creation of consciousness.
Illusory, in other words. Yeah.
Yeah, from Buddha's viewpoint, it's all an illusion.
Yeah.
Yes, I say it's all, virtual.
Yeah.
It's information. So it's understanding. So that's kind of a difference. So from a physicist's viewpoint, it's real and it's finite. But from all of our interaction with it, it appears to us and seems to us to be forever and infinite. That's our sense of it, just like it would be our sense of it floating in the middle of the ocean. But it doesn't mean that it is. Now, what does the difference does that boundary make? It makes no difference whatsoever. It's not important. So in my model of consciousness, the fact that it has a boundary doesn't actually lead to anything important. Saying that it's infinite doesn't actually lead to anything important, because both of those are language. It's just, it's metaphor. It's the way we express our ideas. Yeah. So I think that's, it's a difference between philosophy and science in a way that you see the world and express it. But it doesn't really affect the conclusions that you come to, because all of Rupert's conclusions are my conclusions as well.
Yeah.
And arguing over whether it's really infinite or not, to me, seems like a silly, non-functional argument, because that doesn't matter. That's a detail of description.
Yeah.
And it's not really fundamental to becoming love.
No. Okay. Which is where we're going to end up on this podcast, becoming love. But still, Rupert, I want to ask you that. So two things that Tom says about consciousness, and you've already acknowledged the limits of language. And I know, Rupert, you say really the only real way to understand this, and you alluded to it as well, Tom, by saying it's so far beyond human understanding. It's an understatement. But you talk about it in terms of it can only be really understood through silence. But still, coming back to the language we do have available to us, in terms of Tom saying, consciousness could have a boundary, and also that consciousness itself is evolving. What's your take on that?
Neither are my experience. Everything that I am conscious or aware of, and Tom, I don't know if this is the same for you, but I use the words consciousness and awareness synonymously. So everything that I am aware of changes. But in my experience, the fact of being aware is always the same experience. Whatever it is that is aware of my current experience is exactly the same as whatever it was that was aware of my experience 2 minutes ago, 2 days ago, 2 years ago, or when I was a 2-year-old boy. The content of my consciousness or awareness changes continuously. But the fact of being aware or awareness itself never changes. And so I would suggest that staying close to the evidence of experience, I would suggest that consciousness doesn't evolve. Likewise, is consciousness finite? Again, now I was going to say, in my experience of consciousness, what do we mean when we speak of my experience of consciousness? Now, what could experience or know consciousness? What would its quality have to be? Well, one, it would obviously have to be present. Something that is not present could not know anything, let alone consciousness. 2, it would have to be aware. Something that was not aware could not be aware of anything, let alone awareness. These 2 criteria are essential. That which knows consciousness or awareness must itself be present and aware. What would that be? Awareness. So consciousness or awareness is known by itself. It is not known by an avatar or a finite mind. A finite mind cannot know. I think in Tom, in your language, I would think you would say that the avatar cannot know the guy that's playing the game, because the guy that's playing the game is outside the game. The avatar is inside the game. I would say that the avatar, that the finite mind cannot know, if you'll forgive me saying so, infinite consciousness, because the finite mind imposes its own limitations on everything that it knows, and everything that it knows appears in conformity with those limitations. So the consciousness itself can never be known via the agency of the avatar or the finite mind, in the same way that the world is known by the avatar or the finite mind. Our knowledge of consciousness is the only element of experience. It is a unique experience, albeit a non-objective one, that is not mediated through the faculties of the avatar or the finite mind. So when I say my experience of awareness, I'm speaking on behalf of awareness. What I'm saying is that in awareness's experience of itself, it finds no limits. It finds a limit to everything that it is aware of: thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions. But if it were to turn the light of its knowing on itself and were to, so to speak, taste or know itself, the simple fact of being aware, it finds no limit there. So for this reason, and likewise, going back to your first point, is consciousness unchanging? It is only consciousness that knows consciousness. Only awareness is aware of awareness. In awareness's experience of itself, if we were to take a sample now of awareness's knowledge of itself now, and we were to have done so when we were all 2-year-old boys, the experience would be identical. The awareness is never changed by its content. So awareness itself never changes or evolves. The content of awareness, which I think, Tom, you would call information, what I would call the activity of consciousness, always changes and evolves.
Tom?
Okay.